I never thought much about children refusing school. Every boy has his days when he'd rather run the fields than sit stiff-backed at a desk. But when it came to my younger brother, Michael, in the autumn of 1943, what he said chilled me in a way I've never shaken off, not even now, decades later. He was only 9 years old, pale-faced and wiry, yet he had a stubbornness that seemed to come from somewhere far older than him. The morning he first refused to leave the house, my mother tried coaxing, then shouting, then threatening with the strap. He simply sat on the edge of his bed, his bare feet dangling, his arms folded tight across his chest. His voice was calm when he said it, and maybe that was what unsettled me most. I won't go back there. He killed me once already. I remember looking at him sharply, half expecting a smirk, some childish attempt at drama. But his face was composed, serious, and his eyes had that odd glassy look as if he was staring not at me, but at something through me, beyond me. My mother dismissed it as nonsense, though her face tightened. My father, who had been shaving in the kitchen with his razor and mirror propped against the teapot, came storming into the room with foam still clinging to his jaw. He grabbed Michael by the arm and barked, "You'll go and that's the end of it." Michael didn't even flinch. He just repeated the same line. "He killed me once already. I won't let him do it again." The days that followed were a war in the house. Father demanded obedience, mother pleaded for peace, and Michael sat silent, his refusal immovable. They tried dragging him to the schoolhouse once. I'll never forget it. 2 neighbors helped carry him the whole half-mile while he hung limp, refusing even to scream. By the time they reached the gate, the schoolmaster himself came out to see the commotion. That was the first time I saw real terror in Michael's eyes. He twisted free with a sudden strength, threw himself to the ground, and scrambled away on hands and knees, sobbing, "Not him. Not again." His words made no sense because the man standing there, Mr. O'Shea, was a quiet, aging schoolteacher who'd been in town only a few years. He looked utterly bewildered. That night, when I asked Michael quietly what he meant, he told me everything. His words came in halting bursts, sometimes with tears, sometimes with a hardness that made him sound like no child I knew. He said he remembered being in that same schoolhouse many years ago, but not as himself. He was another boy then, a boy who had been beaten to death by the schoolmaster. I asked him the name of the master, and he whispered it. Callahan. He said Mr. Callahan would strike boys with a heavy stick, not just on the hands but on the back, the legs, the head. He said one day he didn't stand quickly enough when called on, and Callahan flew into a rage. He beat him until his body broke, then told the others the boy had fallen ill and sent them home. That was the last memory Michael claimed to have before waking up again as our brother. I wanted to believe it was just a tale, some overheard story twisted into his own rebellion. But what froze me was how he described the master. Tall, with long sideburns, a crooked tooth, and a ring on his right hand shaped like a serpent. It was too specific, too alive. The next day, I mentioned the name to my grandmother, who was visiting. Her face went pale. She remembered. She was a girl of 12 when a master named Callahan disappeared from Cork in 1880 after trouble with the parents. Whispers had long held he'd gone too far with his punishments. Nobody ever proved anything, but the story of his cruelty had lingered like a stain in the air. No body was ever found. No charges were brought. He'd simply vanished. The family dismissed it as coincidence, or worse, as evidence of some sickness in Michael's head. Father threatened to send him to a doctor in Dublin. Michael grew quieter, but his refusal never wavered. And then the strange things began. He would wake in the night with bruises on his arms and legs that none of us could explain. Sometimes we'd hear him crying out in his sleep, begging someone unseen to stop hitting him. One morning I found him curled on the floor, trembling, whispering, "He's here. He knows I'm back." I was 15 then, old enough to think myself rational, yet I couldn't deny the dread creeping into me. I started asking questions around town. At first people brushed me off, but one old farmer, Seamus Dorgan, leaned in close after a pint one evening and told me he'd been in the school as a boy when Callahan taught. He described him exactly as Michael had: tall, sideburns, the serpent ring. He even added that Callahan had a habit of humming under his breath while he struck the cane, a detail Michael had already whispered to me during his night terrors. I nearly dropped my glass. Seamus said he and the other boys were too terrified to speak, but one child had indeed gone missing, and shortly after, Callahan disappeared. Most assumed he fled rather than face the wrath of the townsfolk. I should have kept my findings to myself, but I told Michael. His reaction was strange relief mixed with deeper fear. He said, "So it's true then, he'll come back for me." From that night on, he wouldn't sleep alone. I let him share my bed, though I didn't sleep much myself. More than once, I woke to find him clutching my arm so tightly it left marks, his eyes wide open, though he seemed not to see me. "He's in the corner," he'd whisper. I'd look, and see nothing but shadows. But once, I swear on my life I heard it too, the faintest hum. A low tune like a lullaby twisted wrong. Coming from the darkness, weeks passed, and the strain on our family grew unbearable. Father accused Michael of wickedness, mother wept daily, and neighbors began to gossip. Then, one late evening, Michael disappeared. We searched the house, the fields, the riverbank. It was past midnight when I thought to check the old schoolhouse. My heart pounded as I approached, the moon casting just enough light to guide me. The door was ajar. Inside, the desks loomed like sentinels, and at the front stood Michael, stiff as a board, facing the empty teacher's chair. I whispered his name, but he didn't turn. Then I heard it again, that low humming. Not from him, no, it came from the chair itself, from the space above it, as if someone unseen occupied it. I don't know where the courage came from, but I rushed forward and seized him. The moment I touched him, his body convulsed, and he screamed. Not in his own small voice, but in something deeper, guttural. "He's here! He's here!" he shrieked, clawing at me. For a second, I felt it too, a presence, heavy, watching, cruel. The air pressed down on me. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was gone. The humming ceased. Michael collapsed in my arms, sobbing. We brought him home, but he was never the same after that. He grew withdrawn, speaking little, and when he did, it was always about Callahan. "He wants me back," he'd mutter. Father finally arranged for him to stay with relatives in Cary, thinking distance would cure him. I didn't see him for months. Then in February, word came that he had taken ill. They said it was fever, but when I visited, I knew better. He was wasted away, bruises dotting his skin as if from unseen blows. The last words he ever spoke to me were whispered with cracked lips. "Tell them he did it again." He died that night. He was 9 years old. Our family never recovered. Mother carried guilt until her own death, and father drank himself into an early grave. I left Cork not long after, unable to bear the memories. But the story never left me. I've told it only rarely, for fear of being thought mad. Yet I cannot forget the look on Michael's face in that schoolhouse, nor the sound of that humming. Some nights, even now, when I lie awake in the dark, I hear it faintly at the edge of hearing. A low tune, steady, patient. And I think of the serpent ring and the man who was never caught. If there is such a thing as rebirth, then perhaps there is such a thing as unfinished cruelty too. I fear Michael was right. Callahan killed him. Once, and he found a way to do it again. I've often wondered why I, too, wasn't taken, standing there in that schoolhouse with him. Sometimes I think it's because Callahan wants me alive to remember, to carry the weight of what happened. Perhaps that's his truest punishment. For when I close my eyes, I don't just see my brother's pale face. I see a tall man with sideburns, a crooked tooth, and a serpent ring glinting in the dark. And always, I hear him humming. Story number 2. When I was 17, I started having dreams that didn't feel like dreams at all. They were too sharp, too specific, and too consistent. Each night I found myself inside a bakery, small and dimly lit, with wooden counters dusted, in flour and the heavy warmth of an oven roaring at the back. My hands weren't my hands. They were smaller, rougher, smudged with dough. And there was always this strange, gnawing pressure in my chest, like I already knew something terrible was about to happen. I never woke sweating or screaming the way people describe nightmares. Instead, I woke with the sour taste of burnt bread in my mouth and an ache deep in my bones, as though my body remembered something my mind wasn't ready to accept at first. I brushed it off as stress or some strange obsession with the past. I had always been fascinated with old places, with the way stories and lives lingered inside walls even after the people were gone. But the dream kept repeating, changing slightly. Each time, one night I would be shaping loaves, the next I'd be sweeping the floor, and once, I remember very clearly striking a match and touching it to kindling beneath the oven. Every time, though, I knew how it ended. The final moment was never shown. In the dream itself, I always woke just before it, but the certainty lived in me like a memory. I was going to die there. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who wants to admit they feel like they're remembering a death they shouldn't even know about? But by the third month, I couldn't stop myself from bringing it up to my friend Marco. We were walking home from school in Siena, weaving through the narrow streets the way we always did. I tried to make it sound like a joke, telling him about my stupid bread dream, but he stopped walking and looked at me with a frown. "What bakery?" he asked. I laughed nervously. "I don't. No, it's old. Feels really old. Wood counters, stone oven. I don't think it exists anymore." But Marco didn't laugh. "There was a bakery like that," he said slowly. "My grandfather told me. It burned down. Explosion, I think. Early 1900s. The moment he said it, my stomach dropped. I hadn't known that. Hadn't heard a word about it before. But somehow it was exactly right. I couldn't shake it. That night, I searched the town archives. It took hours of squinting through microfilm, scrolling past faded advertisements and stories of petty theft and harvests. But then I saw it. Headline: Bakery Explosion Kills Young Apprentice 1911. My blood went cold. The name of the bakery matched the one Marco had mentioned. The description was precise: wooden counters, stone oven, small family-run business on Via dei Rossi. The article mentioned a teenage boy killed instantly when the oven door blew outward from a gas leak. Read it again and again, every detail etching itself into my mind. The boy's name was Paulu, 16 years old. No surviving family, just gone in a blink, swallowed by fire. I wanted to tell myself it was a coincidence. I wanted to believe my subconscious had just overheard some local story and spun it into a recurring nightmare. But there was no part of me that believed that. The connection was too sharp, the familiarity too deep. And if I was being honest, the memories didn't feel borrowed, they felt mine. The days that followed blurred together. I kept returning to Via dei Rossi, to the spot where the bakery once stood. It was just another shop now, selling tourist trinkets, but I couldn't walk past without my chest tightening. The dreams didn't stop either. In fact, they intensified. One night, I dreamed I was kneeling in front of the oven, coaxing the flames higher, and I felt the sudden rush of heat against my skin as though the air itself had ignited. I woke gasping, clutching my chest, certain I had just relived the moment Paolo died. I started to lose sleep. I grew pale, restless, snapping at my parents when they asked what was wrong. Marco noticed too. He cornered me one afternoon and said, "You look like hell. Tell me what's happening." So I did. I told him everything, the name, the article, the fire in my dreams. He stared at me like he didn't know if I was serious or losing my mind. Then he said quietly, "Maybe you're remembering a past life." I laughed bitterly, but the sound came out hollow. "Then why remember just the death? Why not the whole life? He shrugged. Maybe that's the part that never lets go. I hated how much sense that made. Weeks later, something changed. The dreams stopped being only dreams. I began to smell smoke when I was awake, faint but unmistakable. Flour dust seemed to settle on my clothes no matter how often I washed them. Once, while dozing in class, I swore I felt hot air blast against my face and saw the briefest flicker of orange in the corner of my vision. I jerked upright, heart pounding, but no one else seemed to notice. I tried to bury myself in anything else, music, schoolwork, even drinking with Marco, but nothing drowned it out. It was as though Paula's death was trying to claw its way to the surface, using me as the vessel. The breaking point came one night when I was alone in my room. I had stayed up too late, reading the old article again, like some masochist. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. Suddenly, I smelled it sharp and overwhelming. Smoke thick and choking. I leapt to my feet, expecting to see flames licking the curtains, but my room was empty. Still, the smell filled my lungs, and then I heard it, the roar of an oven, the kili dhingo, splintering crack of wood, and above it all, my own scream, not mine now, but mine then, Paula's. And then I saw him in the reflection of my window, faint as a shadow. A boy with flower-streaked hair and hollow eyes stared back at me. His lips moved, but the words were silent. My heart hammered so loudly I thought it might kill me, but I couldn't look away. "Paula?" I whispered. The reflection nodded once, and then he was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I looked like death myself, but my fear had curdled into something else, determination. If this boy was part of me, or if I was part of him, I needed to know why. Marco came with me. Together, we visited the city library, digging through more newspapers, records, anything. Most of it repeated what I already knew. But in one small column, buried weeks after the explosion, there was a detail I hadn't seen before. Neighbors claimed the boy had been acting strangely before his death, talking about fire, about feeling trapped. One woman swore he had muttered, "I'm going to die in there," days before the explosion. My skin prickled. It was exactly what I had been saying, exactly what I had been living. That was the moment I stopped doubting. I was Paolo, or Paolo was me. Somehow, his unfinished death had bled into my life. For months, I carried the weight of that knowledge, unsure what to do with it. I considered talking to a priest, a historian, anyone who might give me guidance, but deep down, I knew the truth. This was mine to face. And maybe, just maybe, Paula's spirit needed release. So one night, I went back to Via dei Rossi alone. The shop was closed, the street quiet. I pressed my hand against the wall where the bakery once stood and whispered, "I remember." My voice trembled, but I forced the words out. "I know what happened to you. I know how it felt. You're not forgotten anymore." For a long moment, nothing. Just silence. Then, faintly, I felt the warmth against my palm fade, like embers cooling at last. And for the first time in months, I breathed without choking on smoke. That night, I slept without dreams. I won't pretend everything was magically fixed after that. I still think about Paolo often. Sometimes when I pass by a bakery, I catch myself watching the oven too long. But the suffocating weight lifted, the nightmares ended, and the boy in the window never came back. What remains is something harder to define. A connection, yes, but also a strange peace. I carry Paula's death with me, but not as a curse anymore. More like a scar, painful, but proof that something was survived. And maybe that's what he wanted all along. To not vanish in fire and ash, to be remembered. To be seen. Now, when I tell people this story, most laugh or shake their heads, thinking, I've let superstition get the better of me. But I know the truth. I lived it. And every time I taste fresh bread, warm from the oven, I think of him, of me, and whisper a quiet thank you for the life I still have, for the fire that finally let me go. Story number 3. I remember nothing about the accident itself. One moment I was stepping off a curb in Koblenz, clutching my handbag after a visit to the market, and the next I was waking in a white room with the stiff smell of disinfectant and a sharp pain in my ribs. They told me I had been struck by a car and had been unconscious for nearly 6 weeks. I was 35 years old then, and though the injury had been serious, what unsettled me more was the life I seemed to have lived. During that long sleep. At first, I thought they were only dreams, strange, vivid dreams that clung to me even when I tried to shake them. I could recall, with unsettling clarity, a house on the banks of the Rhine, not the Koblenz I knew, with its rubble still being cleared from the war and the hum of modern cars, but an older place. The streets were narrower, the riverfront busier, with wooden ships, sails drawn tight against the wind. I remembered carrying baskets of goods, the coarse cloth of my dress scratching against my skin. My name was Anna, the wife of a merchant who traded along the river. We lived in a timber-bird house with a sloping roof, not far from the water. I knew its rooms as well as I knew the kitchen of my real home better, even. I remembered my husband's face, the way he smelled of spice and river silt, the heavy chain he wore around his neck when he returned from voyages. The first time I spoke of it was to a nurse. She was adjusting my pillows, and without thinking I asked her what year it was. When she told me 1957, I said, "But I was born in 1542. She gave me a polite smile, the kind one gives a confused patient, and told me to rest. I didn't speak of it again until after my release, but the memories did not fade. If anything, they pressed harder, as though some hand inside me was determined I should not forget. When I returned to my own house, I was restless. My husband, who had been patient during my recovery, grew concerned when he found me sketching maps of the riverbank on scraps of paper, drawing the outline of streets that no longer existed. He thought it was a symptom of the trauma, perhaps even a sign of madness, but I knew better. I knew where my house had stood. I could see the stone threshold, the worn step that dipped in the center from years of passing feet. Finally, one Sunday, I insisted we walk with a historian friend of ours, Herr Muller, who had often spoken about the medieval trade routes of Koblenz. I told him I wanted to show him something. My husband indulged me reluctantly, but Muller seemed intrigued. We followed the paths along the Rhine until I stopped, heart-hammering before a pile of half-buried stones overgrown with moss. It looked like nothing more than the forgotten remains of a wall, but to me, it was as familiar as the face in the mirror. "It was here," I said, my voice trembling. "This was my house." Muller frowned, crouching to study the stones. He asked me how I could know, and I told him of the layout, where the hearth had been, where the cellar stairs descended. I described a carved lintel over the door, a mark my husband had ordered placed to protect the household. I spoke with a conviction that startled even me. He asked me to show him more, and I did. I traced the shape of the house in the earth, pointed to where the merchant's ledger would have been kept, to the place in the cellar where I had hidden coins when my husband was away. The more I spoke, the paler my husband grew, but Muller's eyes lit with curiosity. Within weeks, he brought a small team of university archaeologists to excavate the site. I stood with them, watching as their shovels bit into the ground. My hands shook with every strike, and I felt as though I were peeling back the skin of time itself. When they uncovered the first foundation stone, aligned exactly as I had said, I thought my legs would give way beneath me. More came to light: the outline of walls, the remnants of the hearth, fragments of pottery I recognized, though centuries of dirt clung to them, and then at last the lintel. The carved symbol still faintly visible, though worn by age. I collapsed to my knees and wept. For a while, the discovery was treated as a curiosity. Newspapers wrote about the widow of the Rhine, the woman who claimed to remember a past life and had led scholars to hidden ruins. People came to ask me questions, some politely, some with the air of skeptics eager to expose a fraud. I tried to answer them honestly, But the more I spoke, the more something inside me began to stir something darker. At night, the dreams returned. Only they were no longer simple memories. They were relivings. I woke drenched in sweat, my throat raw from screaming. In the dreams, my husband did not come home. His ship was lost, or perhaps he betrayed me. But either way, I was left alone in that house. Alone and afraid. There were knocks at the door in the middle of the night, men's voices demanding entry. Sometimes they came in. Sometimes they took things. Sometimes they took me. I would wake with bruises on my arms, though no one had touched me. I tried to keep this from my husband, but he saw how I withered. He begged me to leave it behind, to forget the past. But I could not. The house was in me, its stones lodged in my ribs. I felt I belonged more to that century than to my own. One evening, Miller came with news. They had uncovered human remains beneath the floorboards of what had been the cellar. He was cautious in his words, but I understood what he was saying. The bones of a woman, perhaps in her 30s, had been found curled in a shallow grave. She had not been properly buried. He looked at me strangely as he spoke, as though he were afraid to ask the obvious. I told him before he could. It was. I said. That was where I died. After that, nothing was the same. The dreams grew more violent. I remembered hiding in that cellar, the sound of boots above, the shouting of men. I remembered my own terror, the way my fingernails split as I clawed at the wood, trying to keep them out. And then the sharp pain, the sudden stillness, the silence that swallowed me. I remembered dying. I began to see her, not in dreams, but in waking hours. A reflection in the glass, a shape in the corner of my eye. She looked like me, but thinner, hungrier, her eyes hollow. When I spoke, sometimes it was her voice I heard, low and rasping. My husband no longer slept beside me. He feared me, though. He would not admit it. Muller avoided my house, though he still sent me updates about the excavation. The more they uncovered, the worse my visions became, as though each stone lifted from the earth released another shard of the past. The worst came one night when I woke in the cellar of my own home, with no memory of how I had gotten there. I was on the cold floor, my nails torn and bleeding from scratching at the walls. My husband found me there and threatened to have me committed. I could not blame him. I hardly believed in myself anymore. And then, at last, the truth revealed itself. Dreamed again, but this time the dream did not end with my death. I saw the men who had come neighbors, rivals of my husband, men who believed he owed them. They had broken into the house, searching for wealth. They found me instead. They demanded the coins I had hidden, but I would not give them. They beat me. They left me bleeding in the cellar, the sound of the river rushing in my ears. I died there in the dark, clutching the chain my husband had given me. When I woke, I was holding that chain. It lay cold in my palm, heavy and real. I do not know how it came to me across 4 centuries, but it was there. The next day, I brought it to Muller. He held it with trembling hands, whispering of authenticity, of impossibilities. I did not care. I only knew that it meant the circle was complete. I was both women, the one who had lived and died in that house, and the one who lived now. The memories were not madness. They were me. I burned the chain that night. My husband begged me not to, but I knew what I was doing. I threw it into the fire and watched until it was nothing but ash. The dreams stopped after that. The visions faded. I never went back to the excavation, though Muller wrote that they had found further proof of the house's existence. For me, it was finished. I still live in Koblenz, and sometimes I walk by the river. I glance at the stones and remember the life I once lived, the woman I once was, but I do not fear her anymore. She is not haunting me. She is me, and I think sometimes that perhaps the only true horror is not in death, nor in the lives we leave behind, but in remembering too much. Story number 4. I never wanted to tell this story out loud because it makes me sound unstable, like someone inventing fantasies to fill the empty spaces of a dull life. But it happened to me, and every time I try to convince myself that it was just some elaborate trick of memory or imagination, something pulls me back into the certainty that what I lived through was real. Maybe telling it will let me finally put it to rest. Or maybe it will make me accept that there are parts of our lives of time itself that do not fit neatly into reason. In 1992, I was 23, living in Dundee, Scotland. I worked as a shop assistant, nothing glamorous, just enough to pay rent and share a flat with a girl named Maureen. I had never been inside a textile mill, but I was obsessed with them. Not in the normal way, collecting postcards or going to museums, but in the sense that I carried with me vivid memories of places I should not have known. I could see, in my head, the exact arrangement of looms, the smell of grease on spindles, the burning sensation of lint in my throat. Sometimes at night, I would wake up choking on the memory of smoke. None of this made sense because my family had no connection to mill work. My father was an accountant, my mother a nurse. Yet I would insist stubbornly whenever the topic arose. I used to work in a mill. People laughed, thinking I was joking. Only IWSN single quotes to dot. The memories came like echoes, fragments that didn't belong to my own life but pressed into it anyway. I could describe the feel of rough wool against raw fingers. I knew how to tie a broken thread with speed so as not to stop the machine. And I remembered fear, the kind of fear that isn't vague or distant, but sharp and immediate. The knowledge that if I slipped, the machine would not forgive me. I didn't tell many people because I hated the way they looked at me, but Maureen knew. She called it my Victorian ghost obsession. The breaking point came one afternoon in August. We were walking near the docks when I saw a tall soot-stained building in the distance, a derelict structure fenced off and marked with warnings. My legs went weak. I knew it. Not in the way you recognize a place you've visited once or twice, but in the way you know your childhood home, every corner, every hidden mark. I whispered, "That's it. That's the mill." Maureen laughed at first, but I kept staring, unable to move, because the sight of that building unlocked something in me, and for the first time I remembered the end. The fire. I knew with a sickening certainty that I had died in that place. The memory came as a flood, women screaming, smoke curling up to the ceiling, the heat unbearable. The doors locked from the outside to keep workers from leaving, I remembered. Clawing at the windows, nails breaking, lungs filling with black air. I remembered knowing I would never get out. And then nothing. You can say it was imagination, some half-formed knowledge about Dundee's history slipping into my head. But there was no mistaking the weight of recognition. I had carried these fragments for years, but now I saw the end of them, the horror of being trapped in that inferno. I insisted to Maureen that we had to go inside. She told me I was mad, but the feeling would not let me rest, and I spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the clang of machines that no longer existed. After a week of this, I told her I was going with or without her. She came, reluctantly. The mill was easy to get into once you ignored the fence. The boards over the side door had been pried loose long ago. Inside, dust hung heavy, and scraps of old machinery littered the floor. Broken glass crunched under our shoes. I moved slowly, as if retracing steps I had taken countless times before, leading Maureen without hesitation down a corridor into a vast hall where rusted metal frames stood like skeletons. My chest tightened. This was the weaving floor, I said. The looms were lined up here, row after row. The overseer's desk was there. I pointed without thinking, and she gave me a nervous look, as if waiting for the punchline to some elaborate joke. Only I wasn't joking. The strange thing was how much of it matched reality. I could see the outlines where machines had once been bolted down, exactly as I described them. I knew where the staircases led before we climbed them. At one point, I told Maureen to watch her step near a collapsed section, seconds before she would have tripped. She stared at me then, properly unnerved. "How do you know all this?" I had no answer. I only knew. The further we went, the heavier the air felt, like I was walking into my own death. When we reached the upper floor, my hands began to tremble. I knew this place most of all. "This is where it started," I whispered. I didn't mean the tour, I meant the fire. I could see it so clearly, the flames catching on the lint, racing faster than anyone could run, the heat so fierce it seemed alive. My knees gave out, and I crouched on the floor, clutching my head. Maureen tried to pull me up, but I pushed her away. "Listen," I begged her. "Just listen." And then horribly she did. The sound came faint at first, like wind through broken windows. But it grew until it was undeniable. The clatter of looms, the rhythmic pounding of machinery that hadn't run in decades. And beneath it, the cries of women. Not screaming exactly, but the exhausted moans of endless labor. Maureen went pale, swore it was some trick of the wind. But I knew better. I felt it vibrating through me, the return of something that should have been silent forever. We should have left. But I couldn't. It was as if the building itself demanded I stay, to finish what had been left unfinished. I wandered deeper, the sounds following, intensifying. Maureen clung to me, begging to go, but I was beyond reason. When we reached a blackened doorway, charred wood still framing the entrance, I stopped. "This was it," I said. "This is where I died." I stepped inside. The room was half collapsed, ceiling open to the sky, but the air was thick, choking. And then it happened. I saw them. Not ghosts in the ordinary sense, not transparent figures drifting through the air, but women as real as you or me, bent over machines, their dresses smeared with oil and soot, hair pinned back, faces drawn with exhaustion. They didn't look at me. They didn't look at Maureen. They just worked endlessly, their hands moving in precise motions. For a moment, I thought I had lost my mind completely. But then the fire came. It started as a flicker in the corner, a small flame licking at a pile of lint. I screamed, knowing what would follow, and in seconds the room was alive with fire, rushing up the walls, engulfing the ceiling. The women screamed, this time properly, panic erupting as they dropped everything and ran for the door only to find it locked. I was among them. I could feel the heat blistering my skin, hear the gasping coughs of lungs filling with smoke. Maureen was beside me, real and alive, shrieking in terror as if she too had been transported into this nightmare. We clawed at the walls, beat at the windows, but nothing gave way. The fire was merciless, swallowing everything. And then it was over. In an instant, the flames vanished, the women were gone, the machines silent. Only Maureen and I remained, collapsed on the floor, coughing in the empty, ruined room. She grabbed my arm, sobbing, "We're leaving, now." I didn't argue. My body shook so badly I could hardly stand. We stumbled out, through the corridors, down the stairs, into daylight. I don't remember how we got back to the flat, only that when we did, we didn't speak for hours. For days afterward, Maureen refused to talk about it. When I pushed, she would snap. I don't know what I saw, but I don't ever want to see it again. She moved out a week later, claiming she needed to be closer to work. I knew the truth. She was terrified of me, of what had happened. And maybe she was right to be, because the echoes didn't stop. Every night I dreamed of the mill. Sometimes I was working, hands raw, back aching. Sometimes I was burning, lungs screaming for air. Always I woke drenched in sweat, gasping. I tried to ignore it, to go back to my ordinary life, but ordinary life no longer fit. I couldn't walk past certain streets without feeling pulled toward that building. I couldn't handle the sound of machinery without shaking. I avoided factories, even shops with humming fridges. And the worst part was the guilt. Because if those women had died locked in that place, then I had too, I had been one of them. I had left them behind. And somehow, I had been given another life while they remained trapped in that endless loop. I started researching. At the library, I dug through archives, newspapers from the 1800s. It took weeks, but I found it. A report from 1877. A fire at Baxter Brothers Mill. Dozens of women dead. Doors locked, 'cause blamed on lint and poor safety. My hands shook as I read the names of the victims, scanning them over and over, searching for recognition. And then, I found it. Margaret Reed, age 23. The words blurred before my eyes. That was me. I don't mean it resembled me. I mean it was me. I knew it in my bones. I don't know why I was given another chance at life, born more than a century later, but I know the memories are mine. I know I lived and died in that mill, and somehow carried the echo into this body. Maybe telling this now makes me sound mad. But I also know this: the dead don't always rest. Sometimes they burn forever, replaying the moment they were denied. Escape, waiting for someone to remember them. And once you hear their echoes, you can never unhear them. I haven't gone back to the mill since that day with Maureen. They tore it down eventually, built something modern and safe in its place. But every time I pass the site, I feel the heat on my skin, hear the clang of looms, the choking cries. I whisper a name that no one around me knows. Margaret Reed, my name, my first life. And I walk on, carrying the weight of both lives, knowing that I escaped once. But perhaps I never truly will. Story number 5. I used to believe dreams were harmless, just strange echoes of the mind that meant nothing. That was before the nights began, before the same dream clung to me like frost every time I closed my eyes. It was always the same. I was falling into the sea, the water black and bitterly cold, swallowing me whole. I could see my hands clawing upward, pale and frantic, but there was no air, no sound, just silence pressing against me. And below, through the darkness, there was something resting on the seabed, something wooden, ancient, and broken. A boat. Every night I sank toward it, the splintered hull yawning like a mouth. And every night I woke choking, my sheets twisted like I had been thrashing. I didn't tell my parents at first. My father worked the harbor in Bergen, the same as his father and grandfather. My mother kept the house together, always nervous whenever the sea was mentioned, as though she thought it could hear her. I was 17 then, restless and more afraid of seeming weak than of the dream itself. But the nights wore me down. I began avoiding sleep, lingering awake with candles burned down to nubs, until exhaustion dragged me under anyway. Each time, I returned to the same drowning, the same boat waiting below. Finally, one morning at breakfast, I said it aloud. "I keep seeing a boat," I told them. My spoon hung untouched over my porridge. Every night, in the water. My father frowned, half amused, half irritated. "Dreams," he muttered, pushing his chair back. "That's all. Everyone has them." But my mother froze. She looked at me like she was trying to measure the truth in my voice. "What kind of boat?" she asked, and her tone made my father glance at her. "Old," I said slowly. "19th century, maybe. Wooden. It's broken, but I can see the ribs of it. I don't know how I know, but I do." My father barked a laugh, though it was sharp. "You've been reading too much, that's what. Ghost stories in your head." But my mother pressed her lips together, pale. She didn't argue, though she didn't eat either. That silence haunted me more than the dream. A week later I was walking along the harbor when the words burst from me to a friend, John, whose family also worked the sea. We'd grown up together, fishing from the docks with cheap rods and scraps of bread. "There's a boat down there," I blurted, watching the gulls wheel overhead. "A sunken one. I've seen it." He gave me a strange look. "You've seen it? Where?" "In my sleep. But it feels real." I swallowed. "I think it's somewhere out past the fjord. I could show you." He laughed, but not cruelly. "You're serious?" "I'm serious," I said, my voice hard. "I know exactly where." And I did. Somehow, when I thought of the coastline, of the water I'd sailed since I was a child, I could pinpoint it. The dream had etched it into me. The position of rocks, the slope of the seabed. It was a certainty I couldn't explain. John's laughter faded. He was studying me now. The way you look at someone you've known all your life but suddenly doubt. "We could take a boat," he said finally. "See if you're right." When I told my father I was going out on the water with John, he waved me off. He had no patience for what he called childish nonsense. My mother, though, clutched my wrist as I left. Her nails dug in slightly. "Don't go far," she whispered. "Promise me." I promised, though I knew it was a lie. We borrowed John's uncle's boat the next morning. The fjord was calm, but I barely noticed the sky or the air. My chest was tight with a sense of inevitability. I guided us, pointing without hesitation, until we reached a stretch of water no different from any other. "Here," I said, my voice breaking. John cut the engine. "You're sure?" "Yes." He peered over the side, but the water was too deep, too dark. "We'd need gear. My uncle has diving masks." We fetched them. When I lowered myself into the water, the cold stabbed me with knives, though it was summer. For a moment panic seized me, the dream flooding back, but then I forced myself down. The light filtered green, dimming with each kick. And then below, I saw it, the outline first faint, then sharp, the skeletal hull of a fishing boat, resting on its side in the seabed silt. Just as in my dream, the ribs jutted upward, broken and sharp. My chest tightened, not from lack of air, but from the terror of recognition. I kicked upward fast, breaking the surface with a gasp. "It's there!" I screamed to John the words. "Ragged, it's real." We dove again together. He saw it too. When we surfaced, his face was pale, his lips trembling. "Nobody ever told me about this," he whispered. "Nobody said a thing." Back in town, we asked around. But when we spoke of a sunken boat, people turned cautious, evasive. Old men waved us away, muttering. My father grew furious when I mentioned it again, slamming his hand on the table. "There's nothing there," he said. "Do you hear me?" Nothing. But my mother wouldn't meet my eyes. That silence again, heavy with fear. I pressed her one evening, cornering her in the kitchen. "You know something," I said. "Tell me." Her hands shook as she dried a plate. At last she whispered, "That boat. It belonged to your great-grandfather." I stared. "What?" "He took it out one winter with his brothers. They never came back. The sea kept them. The family never spoke of it again." She turned her face away. "We were told never to look." The revelation was a weight pressing me down. The dream returned that night with brutal force. But now, as I sank in the vision, I could see faces flickering in the dark water, men with my jawline, my eyes staring lifelessly from the shattered boat. I woke screaming. I tried to stop going out to the fjord, but something drew me back. Each day I felt pulled, as though invisible strings tugged me toward the wreck. John begged me to leave it alone, but he was just as curious. Together we dived again and again, circling the hull, peering inside the ribs. There were no bones left, nothing but collapsed timbers, but I felt their presence as surely as I felt my own heartbeat. Once, reaching into a crack, my hand closed on something sharp. I surfaced with a rusted fishhook clenched in my palm. It was still tangled with a shred of net. That night, the dream shifted. Instead of drowning, I stood on the deck of the boat, the sea flat and endless around me. Men worked the nets, their voices low and strange, in a dialect I barely recognized. They turned their faces toward me, and every one of them was kin faces I'd seen in faded photographs, staring at me with hollow recognition. And then the boat lurched, water pouring in, dragging us down together. Their hands reached for me as we sank. I woke choking again, but this time salt water burned in my throat. John began to fear me. He wouldn't dive anymore. He said my eyes looked wrong, that I spoke like someone else in my sleep. My parents argued at night, voices muffled, but I heard my mother cry, "It's happening again." My father shouted her into silence. I couldn't stay away. I dove alone. Each time, I felt less like myself and more like something waiting below. Once, inside the cabin of the wreck, I swore I saw shapes moving, shifting in the gloom. I pressed. Deeper, lungs screaming, until blackness crept into my vision. When I surfaced, I had no memory of how I'd made it back up. The nights became unbearable. The dreams never left me. My bed was soaked with seawater, though my window was shut. My skin smelled of brine even when I hadn't touched the sea. And always the voices whispered familiar, bloodbound, calling me home. My mother begged me to stop, but my father forbade the subject altogether. He drank heavily, his eyes bloodshot. Once he snarled at me, "If you go back, you won't come home. Do you hear me? You'll stay with them." His voice broke and he turned away, but it was already too late. I knew what the dreams wanted. They wanted me with them. The final night, I didn't even bother with excuses. I walked down to the harbor and took the boat. The fjord was black glass, the town lights vanishing behind me. My body moved without thought, guided by something older than me. When I reached the spot, I stripped and dove. This time, I didn't fight the water. I let it close over me, dragging me down. The wreck rose to meet me, not ruined now but whole, the deck crowded with men. They reached for me, smiling, and their mouths opened in silent welcome. I knew them all. Blood recognized blood. I set foot on the deck, and the cold vanished. The boat groaned, alive again, cutting through invisible waves. My great-grandfather clapped my shoulder. "Home," he said, though his lips didn't move. I looked back once, up through the water where the surface shimmered like glass. My life above waited there, my parents, John, everything I had known. But it felt far away, unreal. The sea had claimed me. I belonged to it. When I woke, it wasn't in my bed. It wasn't in the world I knew. It was here, on this endless deck, with the boat that never sank, with the family that never died. I had joined them, just as the dream had promised. And if you're hearing this now, it means you've been marked too. Because the dream doesn't choose at random. It chooses blood. It chooses heirs. So when you close your eyes tonight, listen carefully. If you hear the waves inside your skull, if you see the ribs of a boat waiting below, then it's already begun. And when it pulls you down, you'll understand. You'll be one of us. Story number 6. I was 22 years old when I first heard the voice in Jaipur. It was 1988, and I had come there not for history, not for folklore, but simply because I wanted to disappear for a while. I was a different person back then, restless, disjointed, neither fully connected to my body nor to the world. Being transgender in India during that time was not something easily spoken of. And though I had carved out my own small existence, I carried a loneliness so heavy it clung to me. Like a shadow. I thought traveling might silence it, or at least distract me from it. Jaipur, with its endless stories and whispers of royal courts, felt like a place where a soul like mine could blend into the past and be forgotten for a while. It was in a crumbling Haveli where the first incident happened. I had taken a room there because it was cheap, and because the landlord, an old Rajasthani man with cloudy eyes, hadn't asked too many questions. The walls were faded, and the corridors echoed with my own footsteps. I should have felt uneasy, but instead there was something strangely comforting about its decay, as if the building itself knew what it was to live past your time. The first night I slept there, I dreamed not of my own life, but of another's. I was dancing before a court of jeweled men, my body adorned in silks, my arms rising and falling with practiced grace. I could feel the weight of anklets around my feet, hear the tinkle of gunroos with every step. The courtiers watched, some in admiration, some in envy. And then, a sudden bitterness on my tongue, sharp and burning, and the dream collapsed into darkness. I woke gasping, clutching my throat, my heart beating violently. Against my ribs. At first, I dismissed it. Stress, I told myself. Displacement. But the dreams returned, each night carrying me deeper into her life. She was like me, neither man nor woman, but something in between, something fluid. She was a dancer, celebrated in the court centuries ago, her beauty and skill both revered and despised. In her voice, which came to me in fragments at first, I recognized a familiarity that unsettled me. It was as though the centuries between us were dissolving, as though she was borrowing my body to finish a story that had been left incomplete. The true horror began one night when I woke not from sleep, but from the sound of someone whispering. In my ear, my room was empty. I checked the door, the windows, even the balcony. Nothing, yet the whisper lingered, a low, mournful sound. And the words, though faint, were unmistakable. They poisoned me. I sat frozen on the cot, the hairs on my neck rising. My instinct told me to flee, but there was something in the voice that rooted me in place. It wasn't threatening, it was pleading. I felt her despair as if it were my own, and I couldn't turn away from it. Over the following weeks, she came to me more often. Sometimes in dreams, sometimes in waking hours, her voice seeping through the walls of my mind. She told me her name, though now it blurs in my memory, as though it was meant only for me to know in that moment. She told me how she had risen in the court, how her dances entranced kings and nobles alike. But jealousy is a dangerous companion. Rivals conspired, whispering to the powerful that she had grown arrogant, that she sought influence beyond her place. They poisoned her during a feast. She died writhing. Her last sight, the faces of those who once applauded her now turned cold. What chilled me most was not her recounting of death, but what came after. She spoke of tunnels beneath the palace, secret passages known only to dancers, and servants where the courtiers would smuggle them in and out unseen. It was there, she claimed, that her body had been hidden, denied the dignity of ritual, left to rot in silence. At first, I thought this was imagination tangled with memory, my own mind weaving a story out of the fragments she fed me. But then, something happened that shattered my skepticism. I mentioned the dream once to a professor I had met at the local university, a historian specializing in Rajput courts. I told him vaguely, without revealing the voice or my identity as a transgender woman in the story, just saying I'd read something. He looked at me strangely and said, "There are records, you know, mentions of tunnels beneath certain palaces. Few believe them. The entrances are sealed now. But it is said that dancers were brought in that way to protect their modesty or their shame." His words struck me like a blow. I had no way of knowing this, no reason to dream of tunnels that actually existed. And yet the voice had led me there. The more I listened, the more she consumed me. Nights blurred into days. I found myself retracing her steps, wandering palace ruins, peering into cracks in stone walls, as if I might glimpse the shadow of her life. People began to notice. The landlord asked why I muttered to myself in my room. A tea seller near the palace told me I looked unwell, haunted. And I was. Haunted not just by her death, but by the mirror she held up to my own existence. She had been like me, centuries earlier, living in a world that refused to understand her, forced to carve her worth through art and performance, her body both. Worshipped and despised. One night, the voice urged me to go to the palace after dark. I resisted, terrified of being caught, of what I might find. But her pleading grew unbearable. "I cannot rest," she whispered, her tone breaking. "Find me. Free me." Against all reason, I went. The palace loomed like a silent sentinel, its gates closed, its halls echoing only with the night. I slipped through a broken section of wall, my heart hammering. Guided by nothing but instinct and her faint, sorrowful hum, I descended into an unused section. There, hidden behind collapsed stone, I found it, the faint outline of an entrance. The air around it was cooler, heavier, as though the earth itself guarded its secret. I do not know how long I dug with my bare hands, pulling at rocks, scraping my skin raw. But eventually, the passage opened enough for me to crawl inside. The tunnel was narrow, suffocating, but unmistakably man-made. I crept forward, every inch filled with dread. And then I saw it, a hollow space, a cavity beneath the palace. And within it, scattered bones, anklets tarnished with age, fragments of silk long turned to dust. I collapsed to my knees. I had found her. Centuries later, I had stumbled upon her grave. Her voice filled me then, not as a whisper, but as a resonance through my entire being. There was sorrow, yes, but also gratitude. I felt warmth, a release, as though the weight of her suffering was lifting. I wept, not only for her, but for myself, for all of us who live lives that the world does not know how to honor. When I emerged from that tunnel, dawn was breaking. I sealed the entrance as best I could, not wanting looters or curious hands to disturb her again. But something in me had changed forever. I was no longer just a visitor in Jaipur. I had carried a story across centuries, given voice to someone silenced. In the days that followed, her voice faded. The dreams ceased. She had found her rest. And yet, I carry her with me still, not as a haunting, but as a reminder. Our lives, our bodies, our identities may be dismissed, but they are real, they are valid, and they endure. She was a dancer. I am a woman. And though time separates us, our struggles echo the same. It has been decades since 1988, and I have told this story. Only rarely. People might dismiss it as fantasy, as madness, as the ramblings of a lonely traveler. But I know what I lived. I know the feel of those tunnels, the cold touch of anklets against my fingertips. And I know the voice that once whispered in the dark, begging to be remembered. I remember her. And now, so do you. Story number 7. When my son first spoke German, I thought it was a trick he had picked up somewhere, maybe from television or another child at school. We were living in Linz, Austria, in 2001, though we had only moved there from the States a few months earlier because of my job. At home, we spoke only English, and my wife and I were careful about that since we didn't want him to be confused while still adjusting to kindergarten. He was 5 years old at the time, still in that stage where everything he did felt new and wondrous, but also fragile, like it could shatter if I looked too closely. It happened one evening when I was helping him with a puzzle on the floor. He placed a piece, looked up at me with that grin that meant he was proud of himself, and said very clearly, "Das passt." I remember staring at him, confused, and asking what he had just said. He repeated it, slower this time, with a confidence that startled me. My wife came in from the kitchen, and when I asked her if she'd been teaching him German, she looked at me as though I had gone mad. We hadn't enrolled him in any language classes. Neither of us spoke German ourselves. At first, I brushed it off. Kids pick things up, I told myself. Maybe he'd overheard it at the store, or maybe one of the teachers had said it. But then it kept happening. He would ask for water in German, or call his toys by German names, words we knew he hadn't been taught. His grammar was flawless, and he spoke with an accent that sounded natural, not like someone repeating sounds they barely understood. His teachers said he sometimes switched entirely to German during class, even though none of the other kids spoke it. They assumed we had been teaching him at home, and when I told them otherwise, they gave me this look that I couldn't quite interpret, somewhere between disbelief and concern. I tried to reason through it, but the more fluent he became, the less sense it made. He wasn't just picking up vocabulary. He was speaking as though he had lived in the language. One night at dinner, he began talking quickly in German, almost as though he was recounting a memory. My wife told him gently that she couldn't understand him and that he should speak in English. His face went blank for a second, then he switched back. But I couldn't shake the sound of his voice, rapid, sure, filled with a tone of urgency. No 5-year-old should have. The breaking point came a few weeks later. He woke up screaming in the middle of the night. I rushed into his room, and he was thrashing on the bed, his little fists clenched as though he were fighting someone I couldn't see. I held him, tried to calm him, but he kept yelling words. I didn't understand. I only caught fragments that, fewer, Nick Sheegan. His eyes weren't fully open, but his voice was ragged, too raw to be make-believe. My wife was crying, and I just kept whispering that everything was okay, even though it was clear it wasn't. When he finally calmed down, he clung to me, trembling, and said something that I'll never forget. In perfect English, with a tone. Far too old for his age, he said. They killed me here. I froze. My wife asked what he meant, but he just buried his face against me and refused to say more. The next day, when I tried to ask him again, he denied remembering anything. But over the next weeks, pieces started to slip out. He would be playing with his toys and suddenly stop, staring off as though something unseen had caught his attention. Then he'd say things, small haunting fragments, that made no sense for a child his age. I was 20. They shot me near the river. I wore the wrong uniform. I wanted to tell myself he was imagining things, but the detail in his words, the way he said them, was nothing like the games children usually invent. One afternoon, while walking through the city with him, we passed by an old stone wall, not far from the Danube. He stopped, pulled at my hand, and said in German, "Higher. Das ist der Platz." Here, this is the place. He pointed at the wall, eyes wide with a kind of recognition that chilled me. I asked him what he meant, and he answered with the calm certainty of someone recalling a memory rather than making up a story. They lined us up here. I was the first. I stared at him, trying to process it. My wife begged me not to encourage it, not to ask him questions that might feed whatever strange thing this was, but I couldn't ignore it. I started researching. I found records from the war, documents about deserters and prisoners executed near Linz. One case in particular caught my attention. A young soldier, 20 years old, shot along with others near a wall not far from the river. The details were sparse, but they matched too closely with the things my son had said. The more I dug, the more disturbed I became. I showed none of it to my wife. She was already frightened enough, but I couldn't stop. I felt like I owed it to him, like maybe there was some way to explain it, to understand it. But the deeper I went, the more I realized there was nothing rational here. My son's episodes grew worse. Sometimes he would wake in the night speaking German in that frantic tone, as though he was reliving something. Other times in the middle of the day, he would stop what he was doing and whisper things that made my stomach clench. "I don't want to die again," he said once, while coloring at the table. He didn't even look up when he said it, as though it were just a passing thought. I tried to reassure him, telling him he was safe, that nothing could hurt him. But he shook his head, eyes distant, and said, "It already happened." The weight of those words stayed with me. I started avoiding the wall near the river, even though part of me wanted to go back and see it again, to stand there and try to imagine what had happened. But I couldn't bring myself to take him there. The memory of how certain he had been, the tone of finality in his small voice was too much. One night, after another episode of screaming in his sleep, I held him as he calmed down. He looked at me with a clarity that didn't belong to a 5-year-old and whispered, "They shot me because I ran." I didn't know what to say. I just held him, feeling helpless, wishing there was some way to take whatever burden he was carrying and bear it myself. Eventually, as the months passed, the episodes began to fade. He spoke less German, and when he did, it was clumsier, like he was forgetting. By the time he turned 7, he had stopped speaking it altogether. If I asked, he would shrug and say he didn't remember. My wife was relieved, but I wasn't. I couldn't forget. The night terrors stopped, and he grew into a normal boy again, laughing and playing as though none of it had ever happened. But I never stopped thinking about it. Sometimes I would catch him staring at the river, quiet, thoughtful, and I would wonder what memories lay behind those eyes, what pieces of another life had once lived in him. I don't talk about it much. Most people wouldn't believe me anyway. But sometimes when I'm alone, I think about that soldier, a boy not much older than my son was then, lined up against a wall in a city that has long since moved on. I think about how his life ended in fear and violence, and how, somehow, a piece of him lived on, carried in the voice of a child who should never have known such things. And though my son no longer remembers, I do. I remember every word, every scream, every chilling whisper. I remember the way he looked at that wall and knew. And I carry it with me, the knowledge that death is not always the end, and that sometimes the past does not stay buried. Because for a time too long a time, I lived with a boy who sang in German, and through him I saw the shadow of a life stolen decades before. Story number 8. When I was 7 years old, I began having dreams that never felt like dreams at all. They were too sharp, too vivid, too real. I would close my eyes at night and find myself in total darkness, the kind of black that pressed against my eyes even when they were open. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and I'd hear the faint coughing of men somewhere near me. Their voices were strained, choking, and though I didn't know their names, I knew they were beside me, trapped. Just like I was. I would wake up gasping, clawing at my bedsheets, my little chest heaving like I'd been buried alive. My mother thought I had nightmares, the kind children sometimes get from scary stories or movies. But I knew, even at 7, that this was something else. I wasn't imagining it. I was remembering it. The first time it happened, I told my mother I couldn't breathe underground anymore. She frowned and laughed gently, brushing my hair back, asking what I meant. I said, "I don't want to die in the mine again." Her hand froze. I can still see the way her face changed, confusion first, then something close to fear. My father worked in the mines, just like every other man in Harlan seemed to. She told me not to say things like that, not to put bad luck in the air. But I couldn't stop. The dreams kept coming, and with them, pieces of memory that weren't mine. By the third night, I started saying names in my sleep. My mother told me later that I whispered them like a prayer. Thomas Green, Henry Price, Samuel McAllister. I didn't know those names in my waking life, but in the dreams, I did. They weren't just strangers, they were my brothers, my friends, my crew. I could see their faces by the weak glow of a lantern just before it flickered out. I could feel the panic when the ceiling gave way, the rush of air being sucked out as dust swallowed us whole. I could hear the way Thomas called for his wife, his voice cut short by the weight of rock crushing him. I woke up crying, feeling ribs that weren't broken, but still aching as though they had been. My father was the one who finally listened. After I mentioned the names at breakfast one morning, he put down his coffee mug and stared at me long enough to make my skin prickle. "Say those again," he said. I repeated them, slower this time, and I remember the way his face went pale. He told my mother to keep me home from school that day. She argued, but he wouldn't have it. He sat me down at the kitchen table, leaned in close, and asked where I'd heard those names. I told him I hadn't heard them, I remembered them. He didn't speak for a long time after that, just lit a cigarette and stared out the window. Like the trees might answer something he couldn't. Later that night, I overheard my parents arguing in the next room. My mother was angry, saying I was just a boy with an overactive imagination, but my father's voice was lower, steadier, and filled with something I didn't recognize at the time: dread. He said those men had died in the 1925 collapse, long before either of us had been born. He said families still lived in Harlan who carried those names, widows and children who had grown old without fathers. He said there was no way I could have known. My mother kept insisting there had to be a reason. Maybe I'd overheard someone talking. Maybe I'd read something without understanding. But my father didn't believe it. Not for a second. The next Sunday after church, he took me into town. We stopped at a small house with a sagging porch and peeling paint. A gray-haired woman sat in a rocking chair, and when my father introduced me, I could see her eyes searching mine like she already knew something about me. "This boy's been saying names," my father explained softly, and he nudged me forward. My palms were sweating, and I didn't want to speak, but the words came anyway, spilling out of me like they were forced. "Thomas Green," I said. The woman's hand shot to her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears. She whispered that name like it was holy, like it hadn't been said aloud in years. That was her father. He died in the mine when she was just a little girl. Word spread through Harlan faster than I could imagine. By the next week, families I'd never met came to our door, knocking and asking if I could tell them something, anything about their loved ones. And every time, when I saw their faces, it was like a switch flipped inside me. I would remember details I had no right to know. I told Mrs. Price how Henry had carried her photograph in his pocket, folded so many times the creases had torn it. I told the McAllister family how Samuel had sung hymns in the dark to keep them calm while the air grew thinner. I even told one widow, who had been only 18 when she lost her husband, that his last thought had been of her hair ribbon, the red one she wore when they first kissed. She collapsed in sobs, clutching me like I was him returned. The adults were shaken, but the children my age looked at me with wide, wary eyes. I was the boy who spoke with dead men's tongues. Some kids teased me, called me a ghost boy, but most avoided me altogether. I didn't blame them. I was just as scared of myself. Each memory felt more real than the last, and sometimes when I lay in bed at night, I couldn't tell if I was a boy in 1980 or a miner in 1925, waiting to suffocate. Things only got worse when the dream started following me into the day. At school, I would suddenly feel the weight of rock pressing down on me. My chest would seize, and I'd be unable to breathe. I'd hear coughing, choking, men groaning in the dark. My teacher once found me curled under my desk, clutching my ribs and crying that I didn't want to die again. My parents pulled me from class after that, saying I was too fragile. But the truth was, I wasn't fragile, I was haunted. One night, the worst of it happened. I woke in the middle of the night screaming, my fingernails bleeding from clawing at my sheets. My mother rushed in, trying to calm me, but I kept shouting that the air was gone, that the darkness was eating me alive. My father grabbed my shoulders and demanded I look at him. "Who are you?" he asked, and in that moment, I couldn't answer. Because I wasn't me. Not completely. I could feel another life overlapping mine, memories that weren't mine choking me like the dust of the mine still lingered in my lungs. The townsfolk began to treat me differently after that. Some believed I was a miracle, proof that the souls of the miners hadn't been forgotten. Others whispered I was cursed, that I carried their restless spirits inside me. A preacher even came to our house one evening, holding a Bible and muttering about possession. My father threw him off the porch, but I could see the doubt in his eyes too. He loved me, but he didn't know what I was anymore. It finally reached a breaking point when one of the old miners who had survived the collapse came to see me. His name was Joseph Carter, and he was nearly blind by then, his hands shaking as he leaned on a cane. He had been a young man in 1925, just 22, and he had crawled out of the rubble while his friends suffocated behind him. He carried that guilt his whole life, and when he heard about me, he demanded to see me face to face. I still remember the smell of tobacco on his coat as he knelt in front of me, gripping my shoulders. "If it's true," he said, his voice breaking, "then tell me what I said to Thomas before I left him." The memory rose up in me so suddenly I nearly choked on it. I heard his voice, younger, panicked. He had told Thomas he'd find help, that he'd come back, that he swore it on his mother's grave, but he hadn't come back. He had run, terrified, into the light, leaving them all behind. I whispered those words to him, and his face crumpled. He sobbed into my shoulder like a child, saying he was sorry, over and over. My father had to pull him away before he collapsed. That night, I lay awake and realized something that chilled me more than anything else. These weren't just memories. They were pieces of men who had died too soon, clawing to stay alive through me. And the more I spoke, the more I let them out, the less of me there seemed to be. I was afraid that one day I would wake up and not be myself at all, that I would be Thomas or Henry or Samuel, reliving their last moments forever. My parents didn't know what to do. Doctors couldn't explain it. Preachers wanted to pray it out of me. Families begged me for more details, wanting closure. And I was only 7, trapped between who I was and who I had been. The weight of their lives crushed me more than the mine ever could. Until one day, I made a decision. I stopped speaking the names. I stopped telling the stories. When families came, I stayed silent, burying the memories as deep as I could. My father supported me, though I could tell it hurt him to watch me wither under the silence. But slowly, the dreams began to fade. The voices grew quieter. And piece by piece, I came back to myself. Now I'm grown, long past 7. Long past the age where anyone expects such things from me. People in Harlan still whisper about that boy who knew too much, who spoke the last words of men buried in 1925. Some still look at me with reverence, others with suspicion. But I keep the rest of it locked away inside me, where it belongs. Because I know if I let it out again, if I start remembering too clearly, they'll come rushing back and I'll lose myself to the darkness once more. I still dream sometimes though. Not often, but enough. I wake up gasping for breath, my ribs aching, dust clogging my throat. And in those moments, I know that the mind never really let me go. Maybe it never will. Because I was there once, in 1925, choking in the dark. And I'm still here now, carrying their last breath inside me, waiting for the day it finally runs out.